Hello, everyone. As you're landing into this space, very warm welcome to our team coaching circle. It's really great to be here together this Monday, and starting to feel the energy in this virtual room. And as we wait for people to land into the space, feel free to drop into the chat box. What's present for you as you're arriving today? Yeah, just kind of warming up, and it would be great to see, to hear, to see what are the impressions, what is present for you as you are arriving today. So use the chat box to share in one word or one phrase. Okay, the curiosity. Good morning, Dale. Great to see you. Great to have you on this call. So as we're waiting for people to land into this virtual room, it would be great to hear what's present for you as you're arriving today. And just if you could share that on the chat as we wait for everyone to land. Learning, curiosity seems to be emerging into this field today. What's present for you as you are arriving today? Excitement and to connect with everyone and to hear from Colin. Thank you. Thank you, Colette. All right, so it seems like there is a bit of that learning, the curiosity, which is coming up in those chat sharings today. And typically, there isn't one shared state, isn't it? There is and that's completely okay. In many ways, that kind of in the way that mirrors the heart of today's conversation, that we don't arrive as blank slates, and neither do groups. So my name is Agli Holton. I'm hosting today's session, and I'm very deliberately hosting the session not alone. Before I say more about our topic and our guest, I wanted to acknowledge that over last month we have a bit of a connectivity hiccups, and they've been very helpful reminder that very helpful reminder of something what I really care very deeply about this community, that I just, not being single point of failure is critical. So rather than trying to hold everything by myself, I am really very glad to co-host today the session with Colette. Hi, Colette. Just wanted to wave. So Colette is ICF accredited leadership coach, consultant, and she's joining us today as a co-host for the session. So thank you, Colette, for leaning in today.
Delighted to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Colette. Today's session goes right into the heart of the question which many of us wrestle in our practice. When groups are actually ready for coaching and when they are not. Many of us experience moments where team coaching was introduced as the solution, only to discover that something might be fundamentally needed to be done prior. So to help to explore this territory, I'm generally delighted to welcome Colin, whom you can see on this call. Hi, Colin. Colin is Associate Professor at UCL School of Management and author of The Collective Edge, which is a newly released book that brings together decades of research on group dynamics, collective intelligence, and how groups actually function beneath the surface. So, Colin, delighted to have you today on this call.
Yes, thanks so much, Egla, and hello to everyone. Great to meet you, and I love the idea of a team coaching circle, so I think it's going to be a great audience with a lot of real synergy, not just buzzword, but actual synergy between what I'm interested in, what I teach about, and hopefully what you guys are interested in. And I'm always really curious, to take the word from Egla in the chat there, about how this resonates for you, how it matches onto your own practice and your own experience. And so I'm looking forward to getting a chance to talking with you about that as well. So give me 1 second here to set this up correctly.
And Colin, as you're setting up, I just wanted to kind of to share maybe a bit of the arc of the conversation today.
Yeah.
So we have 60 minutes together, and the first half an hour, Colin will share those key ideas, those key stories which are relevant to the topic of the day. And then we'll aim to move into the smaller breakout reflections, just to give that space for you all to connect and to share your ideas, to share what's of resonance. And then we'll come back together, harvest Q&As, we'll close the circle with what's next, as well as ICF CCU information. So that's kind of a bit about the arc. So back to you, Colin.
Great. Thank you. So, as Egla was saying, I recently wrote a book about group dynamics called The Collective Edge. But I've really enjoyed talking with audiences who are interested in teams and team coaching, because this really gets back to one of my core interests and my connection with studying groups in the first place. So before I got into the business of being a business school professor, I actually had kind of an unusual background, which is I was a professional jazz musician. So I used to be a jazz trumpet player, and as you might imagine, to end up where I am now, I was kind of had an academic bent. I was curious about things at a more theoretical level. And the question as I was going through my performing career was why it was that some groups seemed to just click and others didn't. And it didn't have that much to do with the talent of the members. It didn't even always have to do with whether we knew each other or not. And so I really got fascinated with this question about the conditions under which groups could improvise together creatively. And as I was exploring this question, I started a master's degree in what I like to call stuff I made up at NYU, where you can design your own master's degree. And I studied improvisation across different art forms. And as I was working on my master's thesis, I stumbled on the work of a woman named Teresa Amabile, who had studied the social psychology of creativity. And that I was interested in PhDs, so I looked up where she was. It turned out she was in Harvard Business School in this field called organizational behavior, which I'd never heard of because I went to a music conservatory where we had neither psychology nor business classes. But I wrote a proposal to do my PhD with her about this question about the conditions under which groups can improvise together creatively. And to my everlasting surprise, they decided that was a good idea to accept me. And back then, the internet wasn't what it is today. And so I did not know everybody who I was supposed to meet when I was interviewing to get into grad school. And one of the people who I met was this man, Richard Hackman. And Richard is kind of the guru of groups and teams. I met him cold, having no idea who he was and how sort of esteemed he was in the field. And he loved this question about under what conditions, which for him was kind of the essence of really understanding what makes groups tick. Because groups are not these, simple cause and effect relationships. They're these social systems that require a lot of understanding about how all the different parts fit together. And that there's a quote that if you look up Richard Hackman quotes, it'll probably be the first one that comes up, that I think really sums up a lot about how we thought about teams. This quote is, I have no question that when you have a team, the possibility exists that it will generate magic, producing something extraordinary. But don't count on it. And to me, this brings together two great things about they're just true from studying teams. One is that teams can do things that almost no other power in humanity can do. That the biggest problems in the world are solved by bringing together people with diverse skills and perspectives and being able to synthesize those into something that no one person could have thought of, not unlike a really successful jazz band. But Richard also said don't count on it, because getting these parts to sync together well is extremely challenging. And it's so challenging in part because we have most people have mistaken ideas about the best way to help groups and the best ways to make them tick. And so, building on kind of Richard's work, my dissertation was actually about the timing and type of team coaching interventions. And it was motivated by this question that we're going to talk about today. When are teams ready for coaching? Which kind of presupposes that not all teams are. And that I'm not going to talk about every aspect of my dissertation because that would be boring and it would take a lot longer than 20 minutes. But I want to talk about sort of the insights of decades of research on this topic that are sort of the biggest two things we can think about when we're thinking about what it means to be ready for coaching as a team. Now, before we do that, I'm going to ask you guys to put something down in the chat, which is your intuition about what we should do first if we're trying to improve group effectiveness. Should we, A, focus on improving group processes and communication? B, deepen trust in interpersonal relationships? C, strengthen the group structure, like its composition, goals, tasks, and norms? Or D, appoint a strong leader? Now, obviously, we'd like to do all of these things, but I'm just asking in this case, if you had to pick one thing to do first, which would it be? And Egla, I see your hand is up there.
Yeah, Colin. So while we wait and harvest responses, just a quick question. Would it be a possibility to slightly increase the sound of your mic? We had a few members saying that the sound is slightly lower.
Okay,
if there is a possibility to do that, that would be fantastic. Yeah. Thank you.
I wonder if it's set to auto. There we go. Okay. Any better?
That is brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Appreciate it, Colin.
Yep. Okay, so let me get the chat up here and sort of see what people are saying. So a lot about B, deepen trust in interpersonal relationships. Yeah, seems like a lot of B's with a few C's and a couple A's. Not too many D's. So that's great. And this is, I think very consistent with what we tend to find when we ask people this question. And I'm going to tell you quickly about a study where they asked a very similar question about a team that was having a lot of obvious problems. So a team that had a lot of conflict, people weren't trying as hard as they possibly could. They were disengaged. And so what this study was, it was by Michael Johnson from University of Washington and some of his colleagues. And they asked business school students, okay, when you're faced with this team that's got all these problems, what do you want to change? Do you want to intervene to change the process, which is a lot like what a lot of people do through coaching? Do you want to change who's actually on the team and kick people off or get new people on? Or do you want to change the structure? And similarly to this question, the vast majority of people said we should change the process. If we've got conflict, we should address that. If we've got interpersonal relationships that seem like they're not healthy, we should intervene to fix those. And last was structure, with only 5%. So I want you to keep this in mind. So this is what people think, their sort of lay theory of how we should change teams. But now I want to talk about research that gets at the question of whether that's actually right. So if we're trying to improve team effectiveness, should we intervene to try to shape the process by which they're interacting, their communication, their relationships? Or should we intervene to be more like architects and to structure the team and the work it's doing? And I'm going to tell you about one more study now, which is by Ruth Wagaman, who was formerly a professor at Columbia and Dartmouth, and now runs the consultancy Six Teams Conditions, and is the reason that Egla and I met. And that Ruth, one of her most famous studies, was of the Xerox Corporation, the ones who make photocopy machines. And she was studying a really unusual time at Xerox when they tried to have self-managing teams of the copier technicians. So these copiers at the time were kind of mysterious machines. There were a lot of new models, and that, these models often, they didn't know what was going to happen once they get 5 years old, 6 years old, 10 years old. And so the problems they would have were often quite mysterious. And so technicians actually did have to work together quite a bit to share knowledge, figure out what was going on with these things. And that Ruth was lucky enough to study in particular the leaders of the self-managing team, which were the regional managers. And as my children were watching The Office, the American version, for the 1000th time in the pandemic and after, I realized at some point, actually, in the American version of The Office, they become a photocopier company, and that Andy Bernard in the late season 9, I think, is the regional manager of a photocopy company. And if you've ever seen The Office, you'll know that, Andy Bernard and Michael Scott, they maybe aren't the ideal leaders that you would want. And that's because when we're trying to understand the different effects of structure on one hand and coaching on the other, not everybody is an equally adept team coach. That, like Andy, some people are going to be micromanagers, they're going to be abusive, they're going to do things that are not only unhelpful, but actively harmful to the team. And so when Ruth was doing this study, she wasn't just studying, textbook coaching who are encouraging self-management, who are helping people to develop themselves, who are encouraging reflection. She was also studying people who are doing not so great coaching, like we often see in these comedy shows that depict office life. Now, the effects here are comparing the teams that were well structured according to the kind of Richard Hackman textbook that we would expect, where we've got clear goals, we've got tasks that are well structured for the team, we've got this nice small number of people that's somewhere between 3 to 7 people, or whether we have a bad structure. And that what she found is really important for this question of when teams are ready for coaching. So the first thing that I want to point out from this study is that for positive coaching, that coaching that's encouraging reflection, development, self-management, autonomy, that kind of coaching was helping the well-structured teams, and it was helping them a significant amount. But if you were on one of those poorly structured teams, positive coaching wasn't making a significant difference. So you can see the slope of the line's a little bit positive, but that's not statistically significant. Now, what about for the negative leader coaching behaviors? Well, for negative leader coaching, what we see is the inverse effect. So the teams in green here on top, those were the well-structured teams, and you would expect everyone to be hurt by negative coaching behaviors. And you can see that line goes down a little, but again, not significantly so. But the teams that were really hurt by these micromanaging abusive bosses were the ones that were poorly structured. So this is a story about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Well-structured teams were benefiting from positive coaching, whereas poorly structured teams weren't. And poorly structured teams were harmed by negative coaching behaviors, and well-structured teams were sort of inoculated against it. So the lesson from this is that really, when you have to pick what you want to do first, teams that have a good structure are the ones that are positioned to benefit from positive coaching and inoculated from the harms of negative coaching. And it's kind of like this Far Side cartoon where this guy is reminding himself, first your pants, then your shoes. And in this metaphor, the structure of a team are the pants, and the coaching is the shoes. And if you try and do it in the other order, you just don't get as good results. That's not to say you won't succeed at all, but it's going to be a lot harder. So when are teams ready for coaching? Well, the first answer here is teams are ready for coaching when their structure is strong. But if you're trying to coach poorly designed teams, you're really playing a rigged game. And that even if you get short-term results, what you'll find is that structure will tend to pull teams back into negative dynamics. And it's very difficult to coach teams out of that unless you are coaching them about ways to change their structure. Okay, so that's the first way we think about this. And a way to kind of quantify this is in what Richard Ruth and I call the 60-30-10 rule. And this comes from research that looks at a really large body of data about what's controlling variance in team effectiveness. And by team effectiveness, we both mean how well the team is performing its task and the degree to which members are satisfied with their engagement with that team. And what we find is about 60% of the variation in team effectiveness is controlled by structure. And that structure is mostly in place before the team ever starts interacting. And so, if you are coaching leaders or if you yourself are a leader of a team, paying a lot of attention before the team even exists is really your best bet to avoiding problems and trying to ensure the team is effective. But a surprising number for a lot of people is that about 30% of the variance in team effectiveness comes from the way the team perceives its direction and the norms it has for interacting and communicating. But that those perceptions of direction and those social norms are formed during the very first meeting together, and they're surprisingly hard to change after that. So if you're trying to get this 30% of effectiveness in place, that happens mostly during the launch of the team. And that means after that first meeting, about 90% of the team's effectiveness is largely set, and it leaves only about 10% of the variation in team effectiveness to the quality and availability of coaching. And that's the stuff that happens during the process. Now, I'm somebody who has devoted my career to studying group process and team coaching. And I don't want this to sound like that 10% is insignificant, because if we could all change the performance of teams 10%, that would be great. But it also speaks to this idea that the way we intuitively spend our time and attention, this intuition that when we see a team struggling, we should go straight to process, doesn't match the data. And that a lot of the effort in coaching and in working to help teams in any way, whether it's as a leader or whether it's as a coach, would be better invested in trying to get people to do a better job of structuring the team before it exists and trying to have strong launches. Now, I want to switch now to the second big way to think about readiness for coaching. And I want to talk for a second about team building. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this commercial from, I think, the 2000s. It was for American Airlines, where people were caught in a team building workshop and clearly were not into it. They were doing things like saying, how do you feel wearing a hat that says honesty, or playing human chess? And that these are usually when you say, oh, hey, I work with teams, I'm somebody who studies teams. This is what people tend to think of, that these kinds of exercises are what team building is. Now, this comes from research that was done by an educational psychologist named Bruce Tuckman. Oops.
Do you trust your coworkers? Yes, you do. So just relax.
Sorry. Somehow I did something bad here.
Okay, what did we learn there?
Sorry, give me 1 second. I accidentally set off this video.
Is there such a thing as personal space? No, there isn't, because we're all...
I do not know how I did that. So, Tuckman has a model that you may have heard of before. And that model is, this forming, storming, norming, performing, and often people also add to that adjourning. And that these stages come from Tuckman's research on what were called T groups. So if you've heard T groups, this was short for training groups. And they were groups of, groups of veterans coming back from World War II who were training to be ready for the workforce. And there was a really specific, interesting methodology to these T groups, wherein the facilitators of a T group would, kind of sit in the corner as all these veterans were coming in, getting ready for this experience that they didn't really know about or understand. And, everyone kind of get there and they'd wait around, and then, somebody would say, well, hey, why is that facilitator just sitting there? Why isn't anyone doing anything? Why aren't they saying something? And people would start to disagree about what should be happening. Eventually, people would kind of get mad and have these discussions, but come to the conclusion that maybe this is part of it. Maybe this is what the facilitator wants to happen. Maybe we're supposed to take responsibility for our own training here. And then the facilitator would intervene and get up and say, okay, now we're really ready to perform. Now, you can see why Tuckman came up with this model when you're studying these kind of groups. But that subsequent research has found that this model applies best to groups who are the clients of their own work. Groups that are like therapy groups or training groups or social clubs. And that there, we do see this pattern of forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning much more strongly. But when we're talking about work teams that have a deadline, we don't see this pattern so much. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. But that when we think about this, the guy with the silly hat here, and this kind of reputation team building has for these sort of, decontextualized exercises at building trust in relationships, it comes from a kind of slightly mistaken lesson that people have taken from Tuckman's research. And that's that we need to build trust as an antecedent to collaboration. Whereas the reality of teams is that we build trust through collaboration. And this comes from specifically the kind of aggregation of two different kinds of trust. So I'm sure a lot of you know, there's a difference between what researchers call relational trust or socio-emotional trust. And that's like, I trust you with my deepest, darkest secrets. It's a kind of trust that we have in our friends and family to have our best interests at heart and to be acting really in a way that we trust is in our interests. Whereas work-based trust, the kind of trust that you are going to accomplish the task in a way that meets my needs, is actually quite separate from relational trust. And that these two things, although they're slightly correlated, they're largely orthogonal, that you can have one without the other quite easily. And I can certainly think of lots of friends and family members who I would not trust in a work team or want in a work team. And that kind of shows us how these two things are separate. And that the research on this shows that efforts that say we're going to separate the building of trust in relationships from the actual work are less successful than efforts where we try to build that trust through task-like simulations. And these task-like simulations are things that look more like training camp for a sports team, or boot camp, or you see flight simulators and things for airline cockpit crews. And that these kinds of work-like collaboration opportunities are where we build that trust that actually when I'm going to need you to do your job, you're going to be able to do it. And it's something that we have to see in order to build. Now, I want to come back now to this idea that teams that are on deadlines, project teams at work, don't follow this gradual stage model of group development. And that the model that does explain those is what we call a punctuated equilibrium model of group development. And this punctuated equilibrium model says that, like, physical systems, like evolutionary biology, what we tend to see is that systems, go from disorder to some kind of equilibrium, some kind of order. And then they sort of are inertial. They stay that way for a long time unless something dramatic happens. And that work teams are actually quite similar to that, where the norms, work processes, roles that people take on actually take root very, very quickly. And if you watch the first meeting of a team, you're likely going to be able to predict who's going to talk the most and who's going to talk the least, what roles people take on with a lot of accuracy, because these norms and processes and routines form in that very first meeting. But what happens is that groups actually become more receptive to change around the temporal midpoint of their work together, whether it's an hour-long meeting or whether it's a 6-month-long project, where everyone looks at the clock and calendar and says, oh my God, half the time's gone, we better do something different. And that at that point, there's this kind of moment of radical change, which then coalesces into a later pattern that again is inertial until usually right before the end, when again there's this kind of moment of panic and more radical change. So the lessons that we can take away from this research are, one, group processes, they coalesce really quick. They're not this gradual thing where you have all the time in the world to influence them. And they change pretty infrequently because groups create these structures that keep them in place. And that, second, groups are remarkably impervious to interventions, which are made during these times of inertia, these times of low readiness, which are labeled phase 1 and phase 2 here, that seek to alter their established trajectories. And so when we're thinking about how we can coach teams, given that this is naturally where they want to change, there's actually very specific kinds of coaching interventions that correspond to these 3 moments, the beginning, the middle, and the end, where teams are more ready to change. And that the model of this is that at launch, at the beginning, that's when teams are most open to coaching that's geared at their motivation and applying sufficient effort to what they're doing. And this is often like you see the pregame speech from sports coaches, where we're trying to get excited about the mission, about what we're going to be doing here, about the challenges that we're going to face that we have not yet faced. And so motivational interventions tend to work well at the very beginning. But that actually trying to create a task-appropriate strategy at the very beginning is quite challenging, especially in new teams where people don't know one another, they don't know the task as well. And so it's hard for them to sort of understand the fit between the team that they have and the task they're doing. Whereas at the temporal midpoint, when they're open to change anyway, this is the time where teams are most open to consultative interventions that help them develop a new strategy. And that last, when the pressure's on, it's hard to get people to build and develop new skills within a team and have these kind of educational interventions because people are under other kinds of pressures from the deadline, from the task, and their daily work. And that the time when people are most open to this kind of learning is at the end, usually right after the task is over, when they're most open to reflection. So overall, to answer this question of when are teams ready for coaching? First, when their structure is strong. But second, teams are most ready for coaching at launches, midpoints, and ends of any task. And that it's much harder to coach teams during other times when they're not ready for it, unless you can create this sense of disruption, this sense of beginning something new or ending something old. And that a big skill for team leaders is to create as many of these senses of beginnings, middles, and ends as they can. And that's what allows them to have more points of intervention. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to teams than just this, and that in my book I talk about a lot of different things. I saw somebody talking about Vanessa Druskett as well, who was actually in exactly the same research lab with Richard Hackman and Ruth as I was, so we know each other quite well and are talking about this from slightly different perspectives. This is a much more structuralist perspective, but that the idea here is that group process is mostly a product of structural constraints. The effort that people exert and the way they're able to coordinate depends on their composition goals, tasks, and norms, and that creating psychological safety and offering high-quality coaching can help this process and help create cycles where we revise this structure more effectively. So I want to make sure that we have time to reflect on this and that we have some time to hear from you guys and your questions. But if anyone's coming to the Institute of Coaching conference, I used to be on the Scientific Advisory Board, and I will be speaking there. And I've been doing a lot of great research about how teams within organizations can get the help and coaching that they need. So thank you, and I'm going to turn, if you want to stay connected, here's some ways to do it. And I want to turn it back over to Egla, who will set us off with some of our discussion questions.
Thank you very much, Colin. Such a thought-provoking input last 30 minutes, right? Very rich input from your side. So we would like to use next 10 minutes in inviting you to spend some time in breakout groups and kind of reflect on those questions which you can see in the chat. And I can very briefly just share those on the screen too. So in the smaller groups, we invite you to think about how you can heighten the chances that teams you work with are ready for coaching. And what might be some of the ways how you can help teams that might not be as ready, right? So we'll have 10 minutes in smaller groups, and I will teleport you all, enjoy the conversation. What we would like to invite you to do when you return, please kind of, agree as a group on one question which you would like Colin to answer. We'll have quite limited amount of time together towards the end. So it would be great to have that alignment in your smaller groups around what is that you would like to ask Colin. So enjoy the conversation. I'll open the rooms and we'll be back in 10 minutes. All right, welcome back. Welcome back. I hope that you enjoyed the conversations in smaller groups. And we have next 10 minutes with Colin left to really to see what emerged in those smaller groups. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free either to use chat or raise your hand and share with the rest of the community. All right, so I see that there was a lovely appreciation shared by Chelsea towards Jails and Mohammed, which is great. So again, if you have any comments or questions, James, you're first. If you want to unmute yourself and share, that would be great.
Yeah, I was just going to, in our discussion, it prompted a thought about heighten the chances the team are ready for coaching. One was working with the team leader or the more senior person within the organization to assess where the team is at from a structure perspective. I was very much aligned with the conversation where when there's very good structure in place, it opens up a great, there's a frame in place for coaching opportunities, and without structure, it can be very, very challenging. So I think the conversation around structure and then the early stage, the midterm, and the reflection afterwards, I really resonated with both of those. But I'd love to hear more about maybe a comment on meeting the leader or the business owner or somebody that really understands the dynamic of the team in advance of even starting out in assessing the readiness for coaching.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I'm glad all that resonates with you, and I think it's so important to have buy-in from people who have some influence over structure. And I know that's not always possible with every single engagement and every single team, but that a lot of times if I'm working with a team that we don't have quite as much influence over the people who can change structure, a lot of what I'm trying to help them do is to brainstorm ways that they themselves can start to create that influence, and how they're going to think about pitching some of these ideas about structural changes that they decide are needed to other stakeholders, to people who could help them change that. And a lot of times that can take the form of asking for help. So I think, obviously, James, I think you're exactly right. The best course of action is to have buy-in from those stakeholders and to be meeting with them and working directly with them. But the kind of second order thing then when you don't have that is to be working with them directly, and they're going to know, their bosses and their stakeholders better than we ever can about how to think about creating that influence for themselves.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Colin.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, James.
Thanks, James, for the question. We have Luis. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name properly. Please share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Loes, from the Netherlands. I think I want to thank everybody for perspectives and the presentation, Colin. And I think this webinar is amazing. I really am grateful for that, because coaching a group is, I think, leadership is influence. And instead of just starting to coach and think that's effective, there is a whole science behind it, and at the right using the right time, the right moment, and the right handles to create trust. And just like Colin said, start a middle and an end, so they can let it land what you are sharing, and reflect on that in certain moments. And I believe in transformational approach that's more sustainable, I think, than transactional. I'm a transformational education at Coach Masters Academy Global, but I think let them create in their minds, expand their minds, and let them create themselves. Then you are more successful in sustainable coaching and making a change, creating a change, than that you tell them what to do or ask them what to do. And just like Colin shared, it's more effective. There's whole science behind it. And when you educate yourself and use that handles, you are more effective than that you just start coaching. And maybe that's why some leaders are effective and some don't, or are not effective, and they tried very hard, but the team is not working the way they like them to do, because they use the wrong handles. And that's just like Colin shared. And I think it's really amazing, the science behind it. I never knew it, and I'm so learning. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. I'm really glad, Lois. Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, I think the one of the lessons that I've taken away from this is how much people do want to jump in and start just changing the process, and that is people's natural impulse. And so backing people off to reflect on their structure at the same time or even before they're doing that I think makes such a difference.
Thank you, Lush. And I'd like to invite Tom to share the thoughts or questions.
Thank you, Egil. And thanks to Deborah and Manuel. We had a really good discussion about groups, teams, and individual and emotional intelligence. But in an ideal world, yes, we can set the structure before a team is set up and start coaching there. But the reality is most teams evolve, and there's no start, middle, or end to a team. So how do we step in and coach when we can't just stop the team in its tracks and make it start again?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And this is, by far the most common issue with trying to use this framework is that, is like top management teams are often a great example where there's not this clear beginning, middle, and end to anything. But that the challenge I think I would give, you guys as coaches and to leaders of teams is that if you're going to have sustainable change and learning and development, it's matching our psychology to create that sense of beginnings, middles, and ends. And so the challenge for us then is to say, well, how am I going to create this sense that this is a beginning, that this is an end? And that work, again, there's no way for me to, talk about this outside of talking about a specific team and a specific task in a specific context. But that I find that question to be a very generative one. To say, all right, you've got this big amorphous time, that you've been together for 5 years, 10 years, but there's clear punctuations in there of time where there's these opportunities, there's sense that change is afoot, but maybe we're not taking advantage of those. So what are those and how can we create them? And often the moment of reaching out to a coach is that kind of moment, right? That is a moment when the team is saying, hey, we're open for change, and making a big deal about that and saying, hey, you guys reached out to me because you want this to be a change. Let's make this a new beginning. Let's think about relaunching this team and what that would look like. Let's restate our goals, think about what they are, think about our roles and rethink them, and try and kind of restructure this team given this moment of change that we've opened ourselves up to by engaging someone from the outside. But yeah, it's hard, and I think it's the biggest challenge to, making consistent and meaningful change is creating that psychological sense that we're at one of those moments where we're ready to change. So yeah, it's a great question. I hope that gives you a start to answering it. But I think that is, like if somebody masters that, they've kind of cracked the code.
No, that's great, Colin. Thank you. Yeah, stages, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And it's mindful of time that we're heading towards the last few minutes. Nick, if you wanted to share, your question, that would be great. And then we'll aim to close. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. My question's about. I read your book, Colin. Really enjoyed.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and
thank you.
And I'm really curious. You in the book as well. You've called it about groups.
Mm-hmm.
Really about groups, and now in this conversation we're talking about kind of both teams and groups. And I'm wondering in the research that you've come across in your research, what are the differences between coaching teams and coaching groups?
Yeah, so it's a great. So groups is the bigger class, right? Like, so groups can be anything from social categories to, a group of people waiting at a bus stop or watching a busker's performance. Whereas the teams, as I talk about in the book, are the groupiest groups. They're, the kind of the most interdependent, clearly identifiable form of group that we have. And so anything I say about groups or anything I say about, teams can sometimes apply to the larger category and likewise the smaller category. I would say it's rare that people are coaching, So I think, let me first say, I think of this as a continuum, right? So it's not like there's some magic line where we cross and all of a sudden we have a team and not just a group. But there's a continuum between being, completely independent people who don't have much of a shared identity and being extremely interdependent and having very clear have a strategy. We're going to then, get these smaller groups of 3 to 7 people together. And so I think all it's very hard to coach a group of 20, 30 people. And I essentially would just not try and be in the business of doing that. I would try and be in the business of helping them to deconstruct themselves into things that were more like teams as kind of a first stage for this. So I know that Egla has a couple of things she wanted to end with, but that's a great question, and I hope we can engage more about that. And thanks for reading the book, Nick. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Colin, and very mindful of everyone's time that we're kind of going towards the end of this conversation. Just wanted to invite again, if you are curious to continue the conversation, you can find Colin on LinkedIn and continue this exploration. Colin, thank you very much for your clarity, for depth, for thought-provoking thoughts today. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Egla. Nice to meet all of you. Thank you for your questions and your reflections.
Thank you very much. And Colette, also, thank you very much for helping to co-host the session today and supporting this container. Really appreciate you stepping in. And everyone who joined, thank you very much for your presence, as always, questions and willingness to explore. And before we close, I just quick look at what's coming next in the Team Coaching Circle. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll be joined by Colin Cosgrove, who will share the latest thinking on how AI can ethically support team coaching practice. And then in early March, we'll hear from James Longwell, who is OD practitioner at Google, who will share his thoughts around the transactional analysis and how that can support our clearer, more ethical and more systemic contracting in team coaching. And after that, we'll actually kick off with a sprint of 3 sessions where we'll be focusing onto the diagnostics within team coaching, really getting into the elements around how we can diagnose, assess, design, intervene teams at different levels of complexity. We'll start the sprint with Declan Wood and Andy Duncan, who will share the journey behind Team Salient Enterprise and what it takes to enable team coaching interventions at scale. So for those who are collecting ICF CCUs, let me share the quick screenshot. You can grab it here, as well as let me ping it in the chat. And you can claim those ICF CCUs here. They are kindly provided by our Ireland ICF chapter. And thank you once again for being part of this community. Thank you very much, Colin, Colette, for your presence, for your thinking, and take a good care. Really looking forward to reconnecting with you all in the next couple of weeks. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.